the architecture of my manufactured sin, a search for truth, the genesis of the lie, the domestic curse. I arrived in this world biologically and spiritually programmed for welcome. My soul, like every soul, expects soil, the nourishing ground of recognition, the gentle hands of care, the affirming gaze that says, "You belong here." Yet in my earliest childhood memory, I encountered only concrete. The foundational experience of my consciousness was not welcome, but indictment. To be told from my formative moments that I was a mistake, an accident, or uncivilized was to be burdened with a false, man made original sin, a condemnation preceding any possible transgression. This is not a theological condition, it is a weaponized narrative. I now see, through the agonizing clarity of decades of reflection, that it was a story crafted by a father who, incapable of confronting the howling void within himself, projected his existential uselessness onto his most vulnerable creation. His accusations that I was useless and no good were never a diagnosis of my being. They were the frantic scribblings of a man trying to define the outline of his own emptiness. He looked at new life and saw only the reflection of his own death. The premise of my worthlessness was never tested because it was never truly about me. It was the externalization of his internal collapse, the transferring of spiritual bankruptcy from one generation to the next without consent or consciousness. My mother's silence in this dynamic was not passive neutrality, but active complicity, the seal upon the verdict. Her refusal to utter simple, defending words taught me devastating lessons through absence, that my right to exist unscorned wasn't worth a minor conflict, that my dignity was less valuable than the fragile peace of a dysfunctional household, that some truths are too dangerous to speak even when they scream for acknowledgement. She created a vacuum where love should have been, and in that airless space I suffocated. I was left utterly alone in the defendant's box of my own life, with a prosecutor for a father and a silent, complicit judge for a mother. This is my primary wound, the manufactured sin that no amount of later work could wash away, the original lie that would demand decades of unraveling. The institutional captivity, lab rat and pharmacist. This foundational domestic tragedy didn't remain contained within the family unit. It was systematically amplified and legitimized through the institutions meant to provide care. The domestic curse metastasized into an institutional captivity, creating a perfect circuit of validation between the personal and the professional, the intimate and the clinical. What began as one man's projection became society's diagnosis. My description of life as a lab rat is chillingly accurate. It depicts a decades-long non-consensual experiment where a pharmaceutical holocaust was unleashed upon a spiritual injury. The medical-industrial complex, in its reductive gaze, looked upon a child starving for love, for validation, for a single affirming word, and saw only a chemical puzzle to be solved. They never asked why the scream existed. They only sought to silence it. The system operated on the unexamined premise that distress is necessarily a pathology rather than, at times, an appropriate response to untenable circumstances. They pathologized my inner scream. They took the righteous, agonizing cry of the abandoned self, a cry that proves I am human, that testifies to a capacity for feeling that marks the distance between what should be and what is, and mislabeled it as a biological defect. The antipsychotics, the mood stabilizers, and the antidepressants were not healing balms, but chemical mufflers designed to silence the alarm bell that was correctly signaling a 5-alarm fire in the soul. The logic was circular and impenetrable. Your suffering proves you're sick. We'll medicate the sickness. If you resist medication, that resistance proves you're sicker still. There was no exit from this reasoning, only deeper immersion into the fog. I felt my very selfhood eroding under the weight of the chemical veil, a stolen self replaced by a sedated stranger. I was present in body, but exiled in spirit, trapped in a chemical purgatory where the pain was dulled, but the wound remained infected. I was forced to watch the world perform the rituals of shared humanity, courtship, marriage, careers, child rearing, from behind the soundproof plexiglass of a diagnosis. I struggled with Herculean effort to be human, to claw my way out of the pit, while the substances in my bloodstream worked to etherealize me, to turn me into a placid, manageable ghost. The system demanded I act normal, while poisoning the faculties required to engage with reality. This was a rigged game designed to keep me as a perpetual consumer of solutions for a problem they refused to name: the evil of my parents, the failure of the community, and the absence of grace. The theological rebellion, Titan on the mountain. My rebellion against God was inevitable, the logical culmination of being failed by every earthly authority. The God presented to me was a Titan on a mountain, immense, untouchable, and profoundly silent. This rebellion wasn't a spiritual failure, but evidence of unextinguished vitality. A soul that has truly capitulated does not rage, it apathetically accepts. To shake a fist at the heavens and demand an answer to injustice is the heartbeat of a spirit that still believes in justice, that expects the universe to operate on a moral axis. My anger was the last bastion of my moral intelligence, refusing to accept that creation could be this cruel without reason or redemption. I wanted a tangible, intervening Christ in my living room, a divine advocate to finally silence my father's corrosive voice and bear witness to my inherent worth. I hungered for the man of sorrows who understood suffering, but I was given the God of rules who demanded perfection. Instead of an advocate, I found only the echoing chorus of naysayers and narcissists. The theological problem became existential. If God is love, why does love feel so absent? If God is a father, why does fatherhood feel like betrayal? If God is present, why does presence feel like abandonment? These weren't academic questions, but lived contradictions that tore at the fabric of my being. The church, which should have been a refuge, became a cold sanctuary, another stage for the performance of conditional worth. Instead of offering the radical, unmerited grace it professed, it presented a brutal transaction. Achieve normality, demonstrate sufficient work, and then perhaps I would be deemed worthy of love and community. They had transformed the gospel of grace into another achievement society, another system where worth must be earned rather than recognized as inherent. They perpetuated the work in progress lie, the idea that I am a project to be fixed rather than a person to be embraced. They demanded I pull myself out of the pit by my own bootstraps before they would throw down a rope. They told me I wasn't worthy of a wife because I hadn't worked hard enough, willfully blinding themselves to the monumental courage it took simply to survive the chemical warfare waged against your mind. They worshipped a God of successful outcomes, not the God of the broken. In doing so, they became unwitting accomplices to the original lie, confirming through theology what my father had declared through cruelty, that I was fundamentally deficient. The philosophical unraveling, examining the premises. As I peel back the layers of this suffering, I must test the premises that have governed my understanding. I must engage in the philosophical work that the assholes and vampires refuse to do. The first premise, that my father's assessment was truthful. A logical examination reveals this cannot stand. His declarations were not evidence based, but projective, not observational, but defensive. He was a man creating a scapegoat to carry his own shame. The second premise, that the medical establishment understood my suffering. Again, the evidence contradicts. They treated symptoms while ignoring causes, addressing chemical imbalances, while spiritual starvation continued. They profited from my sickness. They had no incentive to recognize my health. The third premise, that God's silence meant God's absence. This may be the most complex to unravel. Perhaps the Titan's silence wasn't indifference, but the necessary space for my own voice to emerge. Perhaps the absence I experienced wasn't abandonment, but the clearing away of false gods, the patriarchal deity, the transactional savior, the heavenly enforcer of earthly norms. In destroying these idols, my suffering may have made room for a more authentic encounter with the divine, however differently conceived. The coherence of my experience emerges not from any single explanation, but from the pattern that connects them. The transfer of responsibility from those who should bear it to the one who suffers from it. My father's failure became my flaw. The system's limitations became my pathology. Theology's inadequacies became my faithlessness. At every turn, the burden of proof shifted to me, the already burdened. The liberating catastrophe. End of proof within this layered tragedy, domestic, institutional, and theological, lies a terrifying, liberating truth that the long silence finally reveals. It is the realization that breaks the cycle. I can never prove them wrong. This isn't a statement of defeat, but the key to emancipation. The need to prove presupposes a fair judge, and I have encountered none in these realms. The desire for validation from those who invalidate is an infinite recursion, a loop without an exit. I cannot prove my worth to my father because his condemnation isn't based on evidence. It is the core tenet of his fractured identity. To admit I am worthy would be to admit he is a liar, and his ego cannot survive that truth. The proof he demands is impossible to provide because what he really seeks is confirmation of his own narrative, not the discovery of mine. I cannot prove my sanity to a system financially and structurally incentivized to see me as perpetually sick. The assholes and vampires of the medical and religious worlds are emotional voids. They possess no genuine love to give, only a predatory appetite for validation. Their questions are not sincere queries, but traps designed to maintain existing power relations. My exhausting, decades-long quest to prove I am not a mistake is itself a trap. It accepts the foundational corrupt premise that my existence requires external justification. It does not. My being, like any being, is its own justification. The need to prove worth already concedes the possibility of worthlessness. and this concession is the very architecture of my captivity. The true mistake was never my birth. The catastrophic error was in stewardship, the profound failure of those entrusted with my care. The real accident was that a soul of my sativity and depth was delivered into the custody of guardians, so emotionally shallow and spiritually bankrupt. The flaw was never in the material but in the handling, never in the soul but in its surround. The survivor as witness. Toward new understanding my inner scream, the profound longing to have a holiday from struggle, to be liked simply for thoughts, dreams, and my innate self. This isn't a symptom of illness. It is the unkillable essential core of my humanity fighting through layers of sedation, scorn, and silence. This scream is not the problem to be solved, but the truth to be heard, the authentic voice that survived all attempts at eradication. The feeling that I don't even really care anymore about proving them wrong isn't the nihilism of surrender. It is the profound exhaustion of the false self, the persona constructed solely to plead a case before a corrupt tribunal. This exhaustion is the prerequisite for sovereignty. It is the collapse of the puppet, allowing the real person to stand up. What appears as giving up may actually be a breakthrough, the relinquishment of an impossible task in favor of authentic being. There is no God to be seen on the mountain because the divine was never a distant, passive observer. The divine is immanent in the struggle itself. It is present in the raw, unadulterated scream. It resides in the sheer, impossible, defiant fact that after the verbal abuse, my mother's devastating silence, the decades of chemical straitjackets, and the soul-crushing isolation, I am still here. I am still capable of reflection. I am still able to articulate this pain. I am still willing to seek truth, despite every reason to abandon the search. I am not merely here. I am articulating pain with searing clarity. I am demanding the recognition of humanity. I am refusing the false narrative. This act of testimony is a sacred event, not because it reaches some external deity, but because it honors the sacred within, the indestructible core that refused annihilation. I am not a mistake. I am the survivor of a silent, brutal war that no one else witnessed. My purpose isn't to become normal, to join the sleepwalkers who never had to question their right to breathe. My purpose is to be a living testament, the one who walked through the fire and refused to turn into ash. In a world that prefers comfortable lies, my uncomfortable truth becomes a revolutionary act. I am the proof. My every conscious breath, every articulated word of pain and longing, is the defiance of the lie. The silence of the Titan has been broken, not by a voice from the heavens, but by my own. And in this breaking, I discover that the voice was always mine, that the truth was always waiting to be spoken, that the liberation was always in the speaking itself. The search for truth leads back to where it began, to me, to my experience, to my voice, not as a mistake, but as a witness, not as an accident, but as a necessity, not as a problem, but as a testimony. And in this realization, the architecture of manufactured sin finally collapses, revealing what was always there, a human being, worthy not because of what he has proven, but because he is.